My name is Val Napoleon, and I'm from Soda First Nation in the northeast of British Columbia. I teach at the law school. I'm the Law Foundation Chair of Aboriginal Justice and Governance, and I'm the Director of the Indigenous Law Research Unit.
And my name's Rebecca Johnson, originally born and bred in Calgary, and have been living in Coast Salish territory since 2001. I teach also at the University of Victoria, where I do criminal law, business associations, and a law and film course. And I've been working with and around the Indigenous Law Research Unit for some time, trying to think about the kind of work in Indigenous law that needs to be done in this country by settlers.
What does Indigenous law mean to you?
I think the best way to think about Indigenous law is that they are collaborative, reasoned processes that Indigenous peoples, our societies, managed ourselves through time. So we were able to have intellectual resources through our stories. We were able to draw from those to solve problems, solve conflicts, and deal with all of the messiness which is created when human beings live together. I think that one way to think about law is that it's a distinct mode of governance along with other modes of governance. And our societies, for the most part, were decentralized, which means that the authorities for legal decision-making and political authority were decentralized through kinship units, through other legal institutions that our societies were organized around, and law operated through those institutions on a horizontal basis. So in its best form, the way to think about law that's helpful is that it enables human dignity and agency and provides ways for people to not just deal with the messiness of human life or internal conflicts and external conflicts, but also ways for people in that society to challenge internal oppressions, internal power dynamics.
For the past several years in my regular law work, I've been doing work largely on the role of stories as purveyors or carriers of law totally within the traditional common law system. So in working with the Indigenous law materials, what's been so interesting to me is to think about the ways that there are resources within settler society for thinking in a very different way about what we presume law to be. And I think for using the tools we have to think more seriously about how we do law with other communities and their stories for law. So for me, the large context that I like to think about for law is law as the set of stories that help us regulate ourselves and our relations with others. For the past 10 years, I've been really interested in the stories settlers have for ourselves. So we have traditional law, so the criminal code, textbooks, all the ways that we teach people that law operates. But in large measure, even within the common law system, law really operates for most people through the stories they have about how we work in the world. And so most people, in my view, really think about law, what obligations they have, how they judge people through popular culture. And so I've been working for a long time to think about how popular culture is actually a repository of our stories. But for us as settlers, many of the dominant stories we have about our law are stories of the Western. So sort of cowboys, Indians, in a way which we presume a space of lawlessness, where we come in and we bring law to an unoccupied territory. So what's been really moving for me is trying to think about how to story that in a different way, in a way that doesn't just reverse who's the hero and who's the villain, but that asks us to think about how to listen to the stories of others and learn from the stories of others in ways that allow us to think our relationships in kind of profoundly different ways. So the stories of the places we live, so that we begin to learn those stories as well as the stories that we've come together, that we draw in with us, so that we can find ways of kind of more appropriately living in relationship with each other in a way that is richer, that doubles up the stories that we have, rather than trying to impose and erase one story or the other.
So in Canadian law, stories are recorded in addition to the narratives and so on. Stories are recorded in case law, and they form a precedent from which we can draw from. And when we think of Indigenous stories, we can also think of them as forming a public record, a public precedent that people had access to and could draw on. And they're tools for thinking. There's an elder from Northern Alberta who talked about how they're about thinking. So the key is not to look at them as sets of rules, like something to just follow, but rather what are the things in that story that relate to this problem or this conflict, and then to reason through that conflict. One of the concerns that I have is where Indigenous law is flattened, as if it's just rules, and that and people just mindlessly lived their lives. And if they followed the rules, then they wouldn't have any problems. And all human societies have difficulties. They have violence, they have vulnerabilities, and so on. And we have to deal with those things. And so Indigenous law has to do the hard work of law. Otherwise, the problem is that we just conflate the norms with the behaviors. And when we do that, we erase the intellectual life of Indigenous peoples.
And the intellectual life of settler peoples. So if we were thinking of examples, in Canadian, if I were teaching Canadian criminal law, often we're concerned with questions about harm and what you do with, for example, harms that happen to children in families by members of families. So there's a quite famous case at the Supreme Court that I teach where we have a situation with an uncle who physically and sexually abused a group of children in the family over a number of years, and then the case works its way to the Supreme Court. So there's a story we could tell about what that harm was, how it happened, how people didn't see it, how the children responded to the harm, what should be the response. Should the person go to jail? How would you restore what's gone on here? But in that case, in that story as told in Canada, we have 3 sets of judgments at the Supreme Court of Canada. So the story gets told in 3 different ways, even within Canadian criminal law, so that there's space for not just judging the story, but for seeing how within our society as well, we have a story and we have 3 majority and dissenting ways of raising different questions about how to think about that case from different angles. But the story of how harm happens to children and families, it's not a story that is unique to any one group of people, but we can go to other groups as well to ask about what kinds of stories they've told and what ways they've talked about it that helps us as well within kind of a straight Canadian criminal law system think otherwise about the kinds of ways to approach kind of what is a real crisis in human community across any culture.
Over the last several years, we've been working with communities across Canada and working with those communities to draw the law from their stories and to synthesize bodies of law. So it's not sort of Indigenous law generally, like you wouldn't do a research project on Canadian law, but we look at harms and injuries and how people in different legal orders responded to harms and injuries. We're also looking at lands and resources. We've done some work with child welfare and orphan stories. There's all kinds of stories that have to do with families and with water and with marine management. So we work directly with communities in partnership. We have worked across Canada, and what we create through that engagement with those communities is a resource package on specific areas of law as determined by the community as what's important for them, their priorities. And that becomes their resource to add to and to apply to the actual kinds of challenges that they're grappling with. And then we have that resource from which to draw to develop curricula, because one of the things we're doing is putting together an Indigenous law degree program, which will be a dual law degree. Students will receive a Canadian law degree and an Indigenous law degree. So we're building resources while we work with communities. There's lots more work to do in terms of once people are looking at how to implement laws, the part of that implementation is figuring out how does it relate to the rest of Canada. And part of the implementation as well is, I mentioned that there's historic legal institutions and law, and there are contemporary legal institutions and law. And what has to be figured out is what's the relationship and what are the kinds of changes, how has the kinds of issues or realities of our communities, how they've changed, and how might law work today in a way that's accountable, in a way that is legitimate and effective. So that's part of the work.
Why does this work matter?
As I've been trying to do my own pieces of work for these last years where I've been teaching this law and film course, focusing on the Western, there was this moment when we had a student, one of our co-op students who came back from Akitsarak, from Iqaluit, from doing a co-op program up there, came back and started talking about some of the films that were being made up in Iqaluit. And I had this moment in the discussion with her where I kept thinking, this is so interesting. In law, we talk all the time about the importance of the Western and this Western narrative for Canada. But in fact, what we sing about ourselves is true north, strong and free. And so that's not a narrative of the West. That's a self-told narrative of the North. That's what makes us Canadian. But then what would be the stories of the North? And so it was this moment of thinking, it's a real challenge for us in Canada to take seriously what it might mean to be a Northern people. And if we're a Northern people, then maybe we should be learning stories of the North. And so for Canadians, why does it matter? We live in this place, in this territory, with multiple peoples from sort of Salish, if we go across we're here in BC, but the locations of the peoples here are very different than those told in stories of the West. So it's been this process of thinking about the importance of our education for teaching us a real history that applies to this land and this people. It's a challenge for legal educators in particular, maybe for most settler Canadians, because we do not learn Indigenous law. And for a whole lot of people, the word Indigenous law, they experience it as if it's, I don't mean as if it's not a thing, like that it's, oh, Indigenous law, what might that be? So the job for settler Canadians in law schools in particular, there's a big learning curve to actually start to learn that law at the same time as we have an obligation to start teaching it. So why does it matter? Partly it matters, I think, because we're at this juncture where Indigenous peoples have been living their laws and talking about their laws all along. So it's not as if Indigenous law is there to be reinvented. It might be to be reinvigorated in some places, or allowed to flourish in places where it's been smashed and tromped down by the society around it, but it is there. But for us to teach it, it means we have a huge learning curve ahead of us, and also an obligation to be engaged in the process rather than waiting until we see ourselves some sort of experts in Indigenous law to teach it. So the excitement, I think, about the project is its openness and invitation to people to come in and participate, to start learning the stories, working with the stories, connecting the stories to their own lives, hearing how other people talk about and learn with the stories and the kind of rich, nuanced ways that they can be used. So it's this moment, really, in time in Canada, with the TRC especially being released in the last few weeks, for people to kind of trust that there is space for them to start to work with Indigenous law, and to see this as a great site of learning and possibility that will do great things to enrich kind of everyone in this country.
So as long as that doesn't happen, we're stuck with the trope of our being lawless. That somehow we either had simple law, or we didn't have that kind of capability to manage ourselves in a way that every society must. And until it's part of all of our consciousness, that trope of lawlessness, that colonial creation, will continue.
Should people learn the Indigenous laws of where they live?
Absolutely. So people in Edmonton should know Cree law, they should know Dene law, they should know Lakota law, because there's some Lakota folks around there. Here we should have Coast Salish law, and it should be that way right across Canada. That presence of law, as Rebecca has said, like, Indigenous law hasn't gone anywhere, but it's been made invisible, and we have to create those lenses through which we can see Indigenous law in the world around us, in how people treat one another, in legal obligations, and so on. And it's true, it's been undermined, and there are gaps, but those resources exist for all Indigenous peoples, and fundamentally they're about citizenship. Like the idea that a people have law, like, just think about that, like, that's central. So fundamentally, Indigenous law, all law, is about who we are as citizens and who we are collectively as citizenries. It's our ability to decide what's important, and our ability to manage ourselves from that basis. So the ways that I'm talking about Indigenous law, in terms of people having access to a public memory, be they stories, having access and ability to engage in their legal institutions, ability to determine what's right and what's wrong, every citizen should have that. That should be a part of our lives, to have that kind of basic dignity and, again, agency. And that's important for other Canadians. Other Canadians should be able to see that as something that matters to them. And I think that the expanding the way that we think about Indigenous law, creating a real place for it in the world, those are resources that extend beyond our communities. They matter beyond who we are. If we think about law as the process of living together in a way that allows us to reason through the kinds of conflicts and problems that we will inevitably have. So whether those are decisions about family, whether those are decisions about harms, if Indigenous law is an explicit part of our lives, then we can look at how things were dealt with in the past, and then, like, draw on that precedent, and then figure out a future course of action on a particular kind of problem. So, but I also mentioned earlier that we can learn about law in a lot of different ways. One of the things that, one of the places that we can learn law from is in why people do things. Like, why do people care about their communities? Why are people part of all the gazillion volunteer kinds of activities that they're a part of? And if you look at the questions of why in the kinds of things that we take up, that we're responsible for, those are legal obligations. And those exist now. They're a part of the world now. And then when we look at all of the different kinds of conflicts regarding land, or decisions regarding resources, we have to have principled ways to come through and deal with that. Without those principled reasoning processes, we end up with a gridlock of conflict. We end up with people in conflict over positions, as opposed to looking at here's a way through. As long as it's legitimate and it's valid, that people will uphold it, then we can get past the gridlock that is a part of many of our communities. So I think that the undermining of our laws and the legal obligations that we have to one another in our own legal orders, that has given rise and exacerbated some of the conditions in our communities, whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or whether it's other kinds of violence, or just a paralyzing conflict. Now, I don't want to suggest that every community is in that situation. There's lots of communities doing amazing things, but we also have real problems, and we have to attend to them. Canadian law is not going to fix it. Nobody else is going to fix it.
In the last year, or a few years back, a mountain, Mount Doug, there was a ceremony to rename it Pacalls, and the ceremony involved Indigenous communities from a variety of Indigenous communities and settlers, and there was a big march up the hill to kind of install a beautiful plaque, carving at the top, and there was a ceremony up there, and I took my kids. So we went to the top and sort of listened to the mountain being restoried. So this sort of restoring that attached new stories to that site. Now, the mountain hasn't gone anywhere, it hasn't changed, but it's changed within my family, and the times I hear my kid correct someone else and say, "Oh, you mean Pacalls," when he refers to the hill. But the shift in that made me think a lot about stories attached to land. And of course we have stories, multiple stories about land, but having that story there opens up a different space every time now I drive past the mountain, take someone to it, move it past. It is possible to re-story things in ways that make them part of a living story about the continuity of a space that has been people have been living and moving around for many times. It's not a spot that people are forbidden from walking on. It's not that it has only one story, it has multiple stories, but the hill became alive to me in a different way than it was before, where I've still carried with me all the occasions of walking up and down the path on Sunday mornings with my kids, but it's a different story now.
Can you speak to reconciliation?
One of the things that for me was, so there's the 94 calls to action from the TRC, a fairly short document. It's pretty quick read through for people to go to. I think it's all too easy for people to think that the reconciliation is Indigenous peoples and the government, or Indigenous peoples and the church, but that feels sort of separate from people. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, that wasn't my ancestors, I'm not responsible for that, it was a terrible thing that happened, but people should fix that, or they should settle that out. What's been really amazing to me in reading those recommendations is how many of them actually invite everyone in. So sort of the first half are, here's how we kind of try to redress the legacy of some harms, and the second half is, what might we do going forward to bring about real reconciliation, kind of reconciliation in a real way. But read through, what they largely call for is for people to work together collaboratively, and the collaborations they invite us to imagine are around things like commemorative sites, or media, or sports organizations, or social justice groups. And the really hopeful invitation is to work together in collaboration, where what they're asking us is not to fix a problem, but they're asking us to embed ourselves in processes of connection with other people. But those processes of connection is what we might actually say is law. less the outcomes of those processes than the fact of the process. The invitation to repoliticize ourselves by kind of taking law power back away from some external thing into the action of working together with others to regulate the concrete problems that we're involved in, and in a way which says to us, you should have the social justice groups and Aboriginal peoples, or Aboriginal organizations, or Aboriginal spiritual leaders, or Aboriginal athletes, or Aboriginal artists working together in collaborative processes. And that is where the hope of reconciliation lies, is in taking our notion of law back down to engagement in a concrete way with stories, where we learn how to better share stories with each other, listen to stories from each other, and figure out how to make connection points across.
So reconciliation, what you've talked about, is in its best form. And I think what's really important is to make sure that when we use the word and when we hear the word, that we imbue it with its possibility, as opposed to just employing it as Indigenous people just need to get over it. So reconciliation, it needs to be a symmetrical process, so that all that is possible for Indigenous societies, and including Indigenous law, is a part of that process, along with all that settler society is, so that it doesn't end up being something that's imagined as being necessary because Indigenous peoples are in a deficit, or because we're unable to get over our history. Like, that kind of asymmetrical view of reconciliation is not helpful. It's not helpful for Canadian society, and it's not helpful for Indigenous society. So I think that one of the challenges with the concept of it is that we have to create its meaning through all of the ways that Rebecca has mentioned, with our direct activities and so on, but also challenge the assumptions through which we understand the world. You know, whether it's the economic system, whether it's our notions of democracy, whether it's our idea of what land and nature is, like all of these different kinds of things, gender and citizenship. I think that if we can shake up some of the assumptions that shape what we see in the world, then we create new ground and new possibilities for reconciliation. But it's going to take a lot of work, individually and collectively, on all of our parts to do that. I think that Indigenous law is one way of making sure that the relationship with Canada, with settlers, is not an asymmetrical relationship. Every Canadian is backed by Canadian law, whether it's informal or like whatever relationship they have with Canadian law. It's a part of their world. It's a part of how they make decisions, and that foundation from which they deal with the challenges in their lives. We need to make sure that our societies have that too, in the fullest possible way. And then there's a possibility for a symmetrical reconciliation.